the exact quote.
But no, it's really good. It really one of the things from a scholarly point of view that I really appreciated was particularly the introduction where he's talking about the nuances in just creative writing about divinity, how, and this was just reflected for me as somebody who writes about theology and biblical studies all the time, just talking about how we use Christian God, capital G, pagan God, lowercase p, lowercase g, um, and things like that, just simple little practices. But he also talks about sort of like even the attempts to be PC, where we like talk about the God of Israel and we use the lowercase g, and the God of Rome. Something he talks about is Litwa talks about is, even Zeus would be God with a capital G, but some of the family gods who roam around the region would be lowercase g. So even like it was just really like from an academic exercise, it was really interesting.
I found that quote. It's in First Apology, chapter
Oh, there you go. It is Justin Martyr.
something or other. He's talking about the Eucharist, and he's
Uh-huh.
saying blah blah blah. He's describing the whole thing that the cult of Mithra does, and then he says,
Yeah.
which the wicked devils have imitated in the mysteries of Mithras, commanding the same thing to be done. For that bread and a cup of water are placed with certain incantations in the mystic rites of one who is being initiated. You either know or can learn.
Huh.
Yep, the church fathers are a gold mine.
Yeah, it's awesome.
It's amazing when you start to really learn about what some of them said. It's like some of them were practically on the edge of being heretics by today's standards.
One man's heretic. One man's heretic is another man's saint, as they say.
I guess so.
Um,
Some of them said some wild things.
Well, it's a great example. For example, even though he is recognized as blessed, Origen's not a saint in the Catholic faith because of some of his views. Um, he's acknowledged as an early church father. He's acknowledged as an Orthodox teacher in some sense, but Saint Origen does not exist because some of his writings were not well received.
Didn't he have some idea about it wasn't universalism per se, but it was something like in the end, after all is said and done, everyone's going to be justified with God, even Satan.
Yes. Yes, he used the famous phrase, and he kind of teetered at universalism, which is what got him in trouble. But his famous phrase is, "Dare we hope to dream that even Satan might be reconciled to God?" So it's one of those like sort of like he's not saying Satan will be reconciled to God, although if you probably got him over a glass of wine, he'd probably say, "I do believe that." But it's that really interesting way of like, rather than saying who's going to heaven and who's going to hell, all that sort of stuff. Oregon's like, dare we dream? Like, can't we just hope that that's going to be the end result? Like that all will be in all. Yeah.
I believe the New Testament passage, I forget which epistle it's in, that says every knee shall bow, every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. It's not talking about people just, confessing and then going into punishment, It's actually, it's a universalist passage. The author believes everybody would be saved. That everybody would be praising God sincerely, and, they'd be part of the saved community.
Yeah, and I agree with that because I think the apocalyptic framework which Paul is working out of is that Isaiah scene that the Gentiles and the Jews will all flock to Zion and they all will praise God, they'll all see God, the Lion and the Lamb will lay down together. I think that's the framework Paul's working under. So naturally, Caesar will be kneeling with Herod and all the other rulers, and when they do kneel, probably the banquet will start, something like that. However, there's also that judgment-y stuff you get as well, particularly in the later writings, And I think I'm trying to remember, but Rodney Stark in his work, which I find really interesting from more of a sociological point of view, he talks about that like monotheism is unsustainable because as soon as you have people dying for the faith, that just throws soteriology into question and eschatology. That as soon as people start dying for the faith, that's when universalism goes out the window.
Yeah, I read Rodney Stark's The Rise of Christianity like decades ago. I need to reread
Yeah,
it because I forgot most of it, but it was a fascinating book in its time.
yeah. It is a really good book, and his other book, his more recent one, how um, how Jesus the triumph. There's the triumph of Christianity, and there's the triumph of Christianity, which is really interesting, where it just talks about like how things are like pure monotheism after the Babylonian exile, when the Jews sort of came up with that idea,
Sorry.
was unsustainable because of martyrdom, and that's where we get apocalypticism from. So yeah, trying to find it.
So you're saying that the universalism becomes less attractive when people start getting martyred they the martyrs have to have a special status and they wouldn't if everyone's going to get saved in the end?
That's not exactly mine. That's more Stark's argument, but I see his point that when if you've got this idea of like everybody goes to heaven, or the reverse, like in before the fall of Jerusalem, and you guys who have been studying the Bible on Earth know this. It appears that the Jews at the time just believed in Sheol, the shadowy underworld where basically everybody goes to die, or like at least, from dust you were made, from dust you return. So it doesn't matter. So it's sort of that paradox of like, well, if if everybody dies in the same way, like what's the point of being good? What's the point of obeying God's law? So that's where like all these rewards ideas come out of and things like that in a sense. But what gets really interesting from Stark's point of view is that once people start dying for the faith, and this is where you're right, Doug, in terms of what Stark is echoing, is the martyrs have to have a place of privilege because they die for the faith. But also the people who aren't as good as the martyrs, who don't die for the faith, or who are worse, or like the heathens and the heretics and things like that, how can they go to the same place these martyrs go to? Things like that.
Well, that's where the different levels of heaven come in handy.
Yeah, and that's where Stark, in looking at this from a sociological point of view, he says like Dante's Inferno gets bigger and bigger, and so does heaven, and it's purely because of these, in his opinion, it's because of these traumas and these problems. We try to make heaven bigger and hell wider, I think is his joke.
How far back does the different levels of heaven go? Like, I mean, it it's Jewish, right? It's a Jewish idea, isn't it?
Yeah, it's Jewish. It's in Jewish mysticism.
Hmm.
It's one of those things where it's like, because there's a few rumbling stuff about people entering heaven and entering heaven in the Old Testament, as you guys know, and different people appear, and in some of the Jewish more mystical writings, like particularly associated with the temporal literature, which Myra Barker's really looked into. Heaven gets a lot more organized, particularly around what the temple's sort of organized like. But then when you get the Christian sort of mindset, and even Paul talks about it. Paul talks about like the upper levels of heaven. So yeah, it's definitely confusing to know how uniformed the construction plan of heaven was.
Yeah, maybe if you're not so, maybe if you're ye of little faith might be emptying garbage cans in heaven. Whereas, martyr, well, he may just have the best time ever.
I still think anything less than full universalism with complete equality in heaven makes a mockery of Jesus saving everyone. I mean, the idea that he's all powerful, and he wants to save everyone, and that he doesn't succeed at doing that just seems wrong.
Yeah.
I kind of see, I have some sympathy with the standard view too, though. Like it's not just that he didn't or wasn't able to save everybody necessarily if everyone isn't saved. It's that he made that option available to anyone that wanted to choose it. Because before there was no chance of being saved because we're all dead in sin, right?
For me, and this is a bit more. I used to be, because I went from more evangelical faith to like swing shot, progressive, liberal, John Shelby Spong sort of like universalism, Rob Bell, and all that. But my sort of leftist Christian theology when I was a Christian got really challenged when I read the comic book Preacher by Garth Ennis. And the reason why it really affected me was there's a scene in the comic book where God is talking to the main character, and he's all loving and shiny and old man in the sky sort of image. And the main character is just at the end of this little dialogue where it's like, oh, I am the Alpha and Omega, love me, and I love you, you are my son, you were lost and now you're found, come to me, my child. And the character's like, dude, like, you let my dad die, you killed my girlfriend, basically, like all this sort of like traumas what's happened in the comic book series. And the main character says, screw you, and God turns into this like raging, angry man and grabs the main character and says, you will worship me, you will love me, I command you to love me. And that sort of flicked a switch in my brain where it's like, whoa, this is sort of like the dark side of universalism. Like, what about those people who generally just don't want anything to do with God? Like, can you force somebody to love you? So that sort of started me on questioning universalism. But then again, then the flip side jumps back, and it's like, yes, but what about the people who don't? What about the people who don't know Jesus but lived a good life, and trauma, questions.
Yeah, those questions are so hard to answer, and even Christians struggle with it because, well, for one thing, heaven itself isn't really described hardly at all,
Mm.
So that's a big mystery for the most part. Like, what's heaven going to be like? Who knows? And then the other thing is, well, I just wanted to say one quick note on the worship aspect. That always struck me as like coming just straight out of that monarchical mindset from way back in the days of Judaism. Like, God is a king, pretty much, in Judaism, and you basically worship him and obey him because he's the king. Whereas in
Or what?
Christianity, you just have a vestige of that. It's still there, but it's more of like you want to worship him and you want to give. I don't know. It seems to be mitigated a little bit, but it's still basically the same thing.
It reminds me of that movie I put a link to in the chat called The Rapture. And everybody starts getting these visions that the end is coming, and this one woman decides to just go out into the desert with her daughter, but it just doesn't happen. So she shoots her daughter in the head, but she can't commit suicide. And on her way back, the rapture actually occurs. And when she's standing across the river from heaven, her daughter's trying to convince her to come in, and she says, I just can't. She refuses, so she ends up spending eternity outside heaven.
Wow.
We love our stories, don't we?
Well, it was Mimi Rogers, so I suppose I wouldn't mind spending eternity in the outer darkness with her.
Quick, Google Mimi Rogers.
More of a 90s babe.
Well, since we have an expert on Gnosticism, or we did with us here, I guess we got to wait till Daniel gets back, I guess. But we should get into the point that the idea that Jesus saved us from sin is kind of just the idea that Jesus saved us from sin is just kind of one view on it. But there's the other view that he like saved us from the control, the demiurge and stuff. And universalism's a lot more logical under that view. That once the demiurge's control over the universe is broken, that everybody returns back to the true God. I just wondered if Daniel had anything to say from that side of things.
I think it does make more sense in that context because, I mean, in the other way, I would feel kind of cheated almost if I was going through life and being faithful to God and not sinning. But then in the end, anyone who maybe lives a really immoral life or whatever, we're all going to end up in the same place. It seems like an abortion of justice, kind of.
The old prodigal son problem.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, but luckily don't have to worry about that stuff, do we? So we'll leave that to the Christians to figure. Oh, but on soteriology, Pope Francis has announced that animals will join us in heaven today.
This guy's, he's out of control.
Not just animals, but atheists too.
Well,
Atheist animals.
I would say that maybe we have to get our cat baptized Catholic or something.
No plants, just animals. Does fungi count?
I went downstairs to have lunch today, and my mother-in-law was like, "Hey, did you hear?" Because a few weeks ago we were jogging, and my next-door neighbor and I were talking, and she made it because she's like very evangelistic Christian, and she was like, you know, as long as I have my puppy in heaven, and I said, well, if you talk to Thomas Aquinas, animal doesn't have soul, I'm afraid, and so it won't be joining you. And she's like, you know, like, of course it will. But then I can tell her, like, hey, Pope's changed his mind.
You'll be in heaven with them too.
Sorry, Geek, could you repeat that? I don't know if he knows his mic is open. I was just going to say to that lady, well, it wouldn't be heaven if her puppy wasn't there.
Exactly.
Unless she somehow got brainwashed to not want her puppy anymore.
You won't want anything except a harp. That's all you'll care about.
Even snakes, apparently. Who knows? So, anybody got a topic, or are we just shooting the breeze still?
I think we're shooting the breeze still.
Good away.
Do bacteria go to heaven?
What was that, Wayne?
Do bacteria go to heaven?
Oh, jeez. Only the good-looking type.
The beneficial ones in your guts.
As long as
Will there be cancer in heaven?
As long as they repent, they go.
Was this like Zoroastrian heaven, you know? Only the things of the good creation go?
Yeah.
Oh, jeez. Marcion would love that stuff. So, if you're playing the Bible Geek Hangout drinking game, we've mentioned Marcion, so everybody, have a drink.
Is that the new rules now? Gotta take a drink every time Marcion is mentioned.
Well, we've been renamed the Marcion Studies Hangout, so. Which reminds me, I've got so much reading to do.
Yeah, I got a different question. Something that caught my attention in the SOBs hangout, but kind of off the topic of the Bible, but still interesting to me. And I was wondering if in any of your reading you ran into anything about this subject. Do you have any maps on the extent of desert and forest in ancient times? In the Middle East and in Africa?
Oh, like that, like only when I've looked through dictionaries and like background sort of books, nothing like properly in depth. The massive book I took a look at but didn't really get into. It's the one Crossan refers to all the time for agriculture and climate and stuff. Oh, let's see if I can find it.
Farmer's Almanac?
But the short answer is no, Wayne.
I know that Josephus mentions, acres and acres of forests being burned before the siege of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. That they did clear cutting just as a military tactic back then.
Well, I think we can be sure that there was a heavier forestation. I mean, like earlier I was listening to this class on the Hittites, and the guy was saying that whole area of Turkey was pretty heavily forested, and over the centuries, people just basically cut them down and used them for fire or construction or whatever. Well, pieces of weapons. So, I mean, I don't think that Palestine was one big forest, because I don't think the climate was so drastically different, say, 1,000 or even 2,000 years ago.
Well, from what I've read, I can't find actual maps, but I've heard estimates that 500 BC and stuff around that time period, Palestine was about 40% forest coverage.
That much?
More.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
That's surprising.
I have no idea. So I mostly know about Corinth because I've been studying it so much for my thesis, but beyond that,
Even Lebanon, we talk about the cedars of Lebanon and stuff. The small forest they show there today is just a small fraction of a percent of what was there historically.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, and in Europe too. I mean, Europe was almost entirely forest, Western Europe, and there's virtually none of it left just because of people cutting it all down.
Eastern United States, like Georgia and Alabama and Tennessee, were almost entirely forest, and there's not that much forest there anymore now.
Yep.
Damn. Just an Indian crying into the camera.
Yep. And I guess also I need to read the I forgot the name of it, Gilgamesh epic. I guess episode 2 of it talks a lot about deforestation. One of our oldest texts about the subject.
Oh, that reminds me of something. So between the Gilgamesh epic and Genesis 1, well, just the whole creation story, but at the beginning of the New Middle East, there's like some similarities with the waters and all that stuff, but then I think it's Enkidu, is that the main guy who's he ends up like having sex with some other character, and then all of a sudden the animals run away from him because he's like not innocent anymore. He used to be friends with them. He could talk with them and be friendly with them, but now they're after he has sex with that other goddess, I think it is, they all run away. And it was reminding me of in Genesis 2, I think, where once they eat the apple, God's biggest concern is that now they can breed, and they get kicked out of Eden. And it just made me wonder, like, is it because I've heard that the only similarity really is that beginning part with the waters and that very starting part. But it seems like there's a little bit of similarity too with the I guess you could just generalize it and call it loss of innocence, kind of.
I actually lost track of your train of thought, partially because I'm eating, but more because there's three different texts we're talking about. We got Genesis, we got the Gilgamesh epic, and we got the Enuma Elish, and the latter two are two different texts. So I wasn't sure which you were talking about.
Maybe, well, if I'm getting the two mixed up, I just mean the Enuma Elish I'm sure about, the beginning with the waters. That part seems clear, but I'm talking about if it is from the Epic of Gilgamesh, the part where Enkidu ends up having sex and then all of a sudden the animals are all running away from him. They don't, because he's no longer innocent anymore. And one of the big concerns in Genesis 2 is that now humans can mate, and God's like, okay, what's going to happen now? They're wise like us, like one of us, and they're just going to keep breeding, and there'll be millions of them. And if they have access to the tree of life, they'll live forever on top of it. Am I not making any sense?
Well, if you're quoting the Bible, you won't make any sense.
Well, I'm just kind of. It seems like there's a loss of innocence theme running through both of those parts. That's all I'm trying to say. It's not a clear connection, but
the Epic of Gilgamesh is still on my to-read list. And by onto my to-read list, I mean I printed out a copy of it yesterday that I plan to get to reading fairly soon.
To me, it seems like perhaps a thematic connection, but not a literary connection.
Oh yeah, I'm not trying to say that. Yeah, just a similar theme. That's all.
No, I haven't read it since my undergrad years, Old Testament, long time ago. So it's much like Wayne. It's on my to-read list, to reread, to re-enjoy.
Yeah, part of it's probably coming from my imagination of what Eden was like too, because I always envision it as Adam's in this beautiful garden and he's friendly with all the animals that God's created, and then but after Eden, man has to start contending with animals. Like, for one thing, he kills and eats some for food. There's beasts of burden, and then there's at that point in time there are animals that are predators too, that can kill people, like lions or whatever. So I'm just guessing. It doesn't say in the text that Adam didn't have to fear getting eaten by a lion before while he was doing whatever in the garden before they ate the fruit. And it just kind of reminded me of the total change of relationship between Enkidu and if that's the right character, I could be mixing them up. And the animals in his case, after he has sex, which is one of the big concerns also in Genesis, which changes the whole relationship again, because they get booted out of the garden.
That reminds me of that movie, Forbidden Planet, that science fiction movie.
Mm-hmm.
When the daughter of the scientist kisses the captain of the spaceship that's visiting, she loses her relationship with even dangerous animals. Now they treat her like any other human. Of course, kissing the captain was a euphemism, I would imagine.
Yeah, Shamat is the woman I'm thinking of that beds him. And the other thing is that Enkidu is like, he's not involved in human civilization at all. He's like in this idyllic, animal-like state, total innocence. And then after that moment, slowly he gets more and more involved in human civilization, which is the same trend we see in Genesis happening. I mean, after they eat the fruit, they sew clothes out of leaves, and then before you know it, they're farming and killing animals, building cities. Seems like there's just a thematic similarity there. But yeah, I'm not saying there's necessarily a literary connection.
I still remember my professor like smacking me across the head almost with just with how obvious it was. It was like, yeah, Cain represents the city builder, and you know, and Abel represents the nomad. And he just broke it down so simply in class, and like my brain just exploded. I was like 17, and it just completely blew my mind when that got laid out for me.
You know, something that was really interesting in Sunday's Hangout was, and Shauna, I think, made this connection. They were describing the origins of the Israelites.
Mm-hmm.
And if you go way back, like probably 1600 BC, you're getting the main cities, if you can call them that, or bigger villages in Canaan, right? But then you're also getting people who are moving out of I'm just going to call them cities, out of the cities, and they're establishing more rural settlements, and they'll vacillate between being more pastoral and more mobile, or less mobile, more established and more agricultural, and that all depends on whether or not they can buy grain from the cities. Because if they're being more pastoralist, they have to be able to buy grain from the cities. So eventually, some of these settlements in the highlands, archaeologists notice as they're going through the different layers of these settlements that had been settled for hundreds of years, so there's a bunch of layers. Eventually, these settlements in the highlands, you stop seeing pig bones in them.
Yeah.
And Shauna was like, I wonder if, in these formative years of the Israelite people, if they had gotten some kind of animosity or they've differentiated themselves from the more urban cities that are more focused on purely agriculture, and that could be possibly a clue to why the Cain and Abel theme, if you will, is there, that you just talked about, between agriculture and pastoralism. Because it seems to be that there's a deep-seated history in ancient Israelites where that same type of thing was happening.
Makes sense.
Yeah, I just thought it was really interesting. Because obviously at some point they started distinguishing themselves. The only way you can tell those settlements apart from any of the other Canaanite settlements is that there's no pig bones. After a certain point in time.
That's something that Jacob Wright talked about a lot in his Coursera course on the Bible. Which was really good. If that opens up again, you guys should all take that.
What was his name?
David Wright. Jacob Wright. Jacob Wright. Sorry, he teaches at Emory University, and Coursera did a program with him and Emory called "The Bible's Past and Political Future." I think it was. It was really really interesting, and it talked about that sort of hostility and the archaeology of the pig bones and things like that.
Yeah. What's this book here, John?
It's actually one of the books I have that I actually read. And it basically, yeah, it goes into, and I'm purely linguistics, so I wasn't fully convinced, but through linguistic studies, it basically tries to debunk the idea that like Genesis 1 is related to Mesopotamian and Ugaritic myths.
Interesting. Yeah, I see a lot of similarities at the beginning, anyway. But yeah, I'm not. They're not necessarily. But I mean, the thing with the waters being mingled together and then separated—that's pretty close. The land coming up in the midst of the waters.
Yeah, it's always good to read some alternative theories. Keeps you
Yeah.
on your toes.
And the Egyptians have something similar too, with like waters being separated from each other. So it's probably just kind of a regional idea that probably goes way, way back.
Yeah, it probably argues, if I recall correctly, that those myths come from more local myths, as you say. They're not direct borrowings. They're not even etymologically related, like Tehom and Tohu Wabohu. Those phrases in Genesis 1 are not related directly to Mesopotamian goddess Tiamat, for instance, but comes from more local types of usage, words and usage.
Yeah. Hmm.
Just put it out there.
Trying to find that Egyptian one. That one goes way, way back. Like, I mean, probably before the time of the first pharaoh we know of. It was already in place at that time. So, um, can't find the one I want. Yeah, in the beginning, this isn't word for word. It's like a summary of it. But in the beginning, there was only the swirling, watery chaos called Nu. Out of these chaotic waters rose Atum, the sun god of the city of Heliopolis. It is believed that he created himself using his thoughts and will. In the watery chaos, Adam found no place on which to stand. In the place where he first appeared, he created a hill. The hill was said to be the spot on which the temple of Heliopolis was built. Um, then he created some more gods. Anyway, yeah. So it seems like just that theme is strong kind of throughout that whole region. For whatever reason, who knows. But then you read stuff like, say, the creation myths of like the native Australian people, and it's way, way different. Looks like Daniel lost his spot, poor guy.
Yeah, it's premium in here. You want front row.
Front row seats to the exciting, non-stop chatter.
Oh, that's what happens when you don't have a book to read, right?
Well, I want to be here, but I'm still willing to give up my spot for Daniel. If we can make it work.
Is my
Well,
is my extra avatar in the way?
no, it already left.
Oh, I still see it on my screen.
Really? No, I don't see it.
I don't either.
Good.
Well, David left.
Oh, there we go.
Did somebody message Daniel and let him know to get it back in?
He probably collapsed from boredom. One thing I know, since you guys don't probably have Pouchot's books laying around, there's an interesting point that he brought up, and I thought it was interesting when I was reading it, that the part in the Gospel of John, I guess Couchot's, and I haven't got that far through it because I was mainly scanning it rather than reading it, that the Gospel of John is heavily influenced by anti-Marcionism. And when he calls the Jews, that says that their father is Satan and has been a liar, all that stuff, what he's actually referring to, I thought it was interesting, that he's renaming the demiurge. So whereas most scholars think that, you know, there's a possible reference to two different gods there, you know, the God of Jesus, the Father, as apart from the God of the Jews, Jehovah, the Creator, that's also a reference to the demiurge, but now John is equating him with Satan, and is also what he means by synagogue of Satan, that they're Marcionites.
What was the passage again?
I didn't say there was a passage.
I thought you said the part in John's Gospel.
Well, you should know that.
I missed that first part. I was distracted.
I would just say there's that conversation that he has with the Jews, and all of a sudden he just says that, you know, your father is Satan.
Does it actually say synagogue of Satan?
No, but another Johannine writing.
Yeah.
But, you know, it's all unity. But anyway, I just thought that was interesting, because it never occurred to me that that might be the case.
It is. It's tantalizing.
Yeah, and that's this 2-volume book, and it's really short. I mean, the chapters are shorter than a Dan Brown novel chapter. And when you scan it all together, it's not a whole lot of text, but there's a good reason. I guess the subtitle is an outline of the beginnings of Christianity, because he doesn't go into too much depth, and I wish he did on some of his points.
What book is this out of?
Creation of Christ.
Oh.
An outline of the beginnings of Christianity by Paul Louis Couchot.
Can't trust those French scholars.
Can't trust the English translation that leaves most of the French untranslated. That really pisses me off. You know, when Dr. Price doesn't have questions, he reads from something, right? So I could just read.
Just
So we're still missing
open
Daniel.
the phone book. Yeah, I think Reuben had tried to invite him again. What was Guy saying wow to? I didn't remember when he said that. To what? It must have been to what you said, John.
I doubt it. Nobody says wow. Okay.
Woot woot.
Well, let me read from the phone book then. This is talking about the prophet John the Baptist. It's like chapter 4 of Couchoud's first volume. Derived from Judaism, the religion of John is no longer Judaism. To be a Jew was not enough to enter into its fold, and one might enter without being a Jew. Do not say to yourselves, we have Abraham to our father. I say unto you that God is able of these stones to raise up children to Abraham. Race did not matter. It was baptism which was the bond in the new sect. The foreign soldier, the unclean publican, might be admitted as well as the purest and cleanest Jew. The idea of a simple religion accessible to all is outlined here.
And that would be something Marcion would reject?
Well, supposedly Marcion was wanted a break with Judaism, so I don't see why that would be incompatible with Marcionism myself.
Yeah.
Although, he's talking about John the Baptist, though. I'm probably reading too early.
If we're going to keep mentioning Marcion, I need to go to the Packy and get a bottle.
I can read from the this cool thing on Daniel from whose commentary is this? John J. Collins.
From Yale?
I don't know where he's from.
I know there's a John Collins at Yale.
Well, I had always heard, well, probably everyone's heard it, the dating using the Maccabean thing with Daniel, dating it in that era. But I was reading this commentary too, and I don't speak Hebrew or anything, so I'd never read this before, and some of you probably already know this, but there's a really good discussion in here about the nature of the Hebrew used in Daniel, and they're saying it doesn't seem to, based on some of the vocabulary that's used in other things, it does not seem consistent with the exilic period Hebrew, but it has tons of signs of and similarities with Second Temple Hebrew, like Chronicles, it says. And then there was another section talking about certain Persian loanwords that are used in it that are also characteristic of that same period, that same later period.
How late of a period?
Well, here it's just saying that it's post-exilic. I don't know exactly where they're putting it other than Second Temple. Because I don't know if you can really pin down the particular characteristics of the Hebrew to a particular date range, other than to say that it's more characteristic of a later period than it is, say, the exilic period. Just comparing it even with stuff that's in the Bible, like comparing Chronicles to I don't know, Genesis or something from the Pentateuch. I wanted to find that part on the Persian loanwords, and I can't find it again.
That reminds me, does anyone know of any easy to refer to graphic timeline that would have the, Bronze Age, Iron Age, Second Temple, Exilic period? It'd be good for me to refer to it when we're speaking of things, because there's so much going on here. It's hard to keep it historically contextualized.
Yeah, if you get the Faith Life Study Bible, which is free still, and you can use it within Logos, or you can use it on the website if you don't want to download Logos. But it has tons of great timelines. Like, it has timelines of Jesus' ministry for each gospel, timelines, historical timelines, say from primeval history up to, I think, the exile or something, and then post-exilic period up to the time of Jesus, and then from Jesus up to, it just has a ton of them like that. And it'll give you like the key events and key things that happen in the timelines. There's like 100, easily 100 of them in here.
Yeah.
Is that what you want? Just kind of a kind of like that standard graphical timeline to see the relative dating of certain
Yeah,
events?
but I'm looking for like one thing that can sort of keep it all keep it all in perspective, where you can just kind of refer to it and be like, okay, we're talking about that period. Because jumping from era to era is a little bit too much for my puny brain.
Okay, yeah. There's one thing in Logos too where there's actually, John, do you remember where that is? It's just a general timeline graph, and you can add. There it is, timeline. So yeah, like right here, there's too much of it on here. This has everything, but you can select a range. So say you want to go BC. Well, we'll just go to the Maccabean period. So let's say BC 200 to 100. So we got that in there. So now you're getting everything. So like for here, you got Book of Sirach is written. Onias the Third, High Priest, 190. And you can add and take away different stuff too.
And that's what Faith Life, you said?
Yeah, Faith Life Study Bible. But for this timeline thing, I think you actually need Logos. But if you're using the Faith Life commentary, there are timelines similar to this, but more specialized, all throughout the commentaries.
There's plenty of stuff on the web too. Like I just typed in timeline of Levant and give me this visual timeline thing where you can click on it and they've got it color coded for the types of stuff going on. So at the bottom you click on different sections and it gives you things like that. There's also a larger timeline, a more general one if you're searching for stuff.
Oh, good.
Anyway, but yeah, you can find stuff too. I thought I saw a PDF here of a timeline of Levant in context with world events. Just typing that stuff in. So probably even Wikipedia has some kind of visual timeline, I would imagine.
Like let's go way back to the beginning of the timeline, like 7,000 Mesolithic age of the world.
Wait a minute.
Okay, that's
Where's
the earliest anything goes is 10,000 BC. End of the last glacial period, and then we can go way forward to. I only have a couple things typed in, so like I have group of people, individual, and time periods. So I took out archaeology. Early inhabitants settle at Jericho, 7,000 BC. Early inhabitants settle at Munhata, which I don't know where that is, probably in Turkey or something, or maybe Samaria. And then early inhabitants settle at Jarmo, 6750 BC. Anyway, yeah, this is a really cool timeline, but I don't know if... Is this one of the features that you can only get, John, if you buy a package, or is it...
It might be. It might be.
Yeah, I won't be buying anything too soon, so it'll have to be something I could just put my hands on readily.
Well, I would get Logos anyway because you can get this commentary on the side. This is Faith Life here, so you can get this on the web, or you can load it up through Logos so you can use it. Say if your internet goes down or something like that. Um, I'm trying to find a timeline in here. Let me go to one of the Gospels. Let me go to Mark.
Logos is free?
Yeah, the base program's free. Like, look at this timeline right here.
Yeah, the software is free. It's like getting a library with absolutely no books in it. Everything else has to be added.
Library with no books.
Yeah, and there's if you go to the logos.com website and you browse their list of resources and just sort it from cheapest to more expensive, it starts off with 0, and you can see what you can add. There's a few Bibles you can add, some other stuff that you probably don't need, but
Doesn't that describe most public libraries these days? No books, like they're like just rows and rows of internet computers and magazines and newspapers, and and DVDs and CDs and cassettes and stuff. It's actually pretty hard to find the books in libraries these days.
well, mine has books, but I'd say it devotes more space to like lounge chairs.
I'm exaggerating, but still, I mean, the amount of the library devoted to books anymore is like a fraction of what it used to be.
Yeah, everything's digital. Here's an example of what I'm talking about, Frank. Like, you probably can't read the text, but this is one of many of the kinds of things they have in here. Well, there'll just be a flow like this, and then different events. Like this one just happens to be for the gospel timeline for Mark, but they'll even have historical stuff too. So, like, if I look, I don't think I have there's no commentary on Maccabees and Faith Life, I'm sure. Probably not. But anyway, it's really good, a resource anyway, so I recommend it. John turned me on to it.
You had timeline. Was that under tools?
Yeah, you go to Tools,
Yeah,
Timeline. Yeah.
It's not there in mine. Because
Oh,
I'm too
really?
cheap to buy Logos, actually.
Then there's a cool atlas too. Have you seen this?
Yeah, I've seen the Atlas. I got access to that.
Yeah, this thing is awesome, and you can just jump to any period you want. You can go like Exodus from Egypt, Biblical World Exodus from Egypt. Check that out, or I mean anything you want. There's just like every time period.
Anything I want, so where's my map at age?
So here, let's go to Assyrian exile map,
Main.
and I think you can usually put in
I like
like
how you can zoom in.
if we were going to the New Testament, we could say add in like go to the area around Ephesus or whatever, and you can see like Paul's travels and stuff. It's pretty cool. But you can get all this stuff online too by now too. But it's nice to have an interactive one that you can move around on.
So is there an average cost of each of these features?
I don't know which features you get with which package. I was mainly looking at the resources you get, which are different books. You'll have to look.
John's saying you basically get nothing until you purchase something, and I'm looking to get something for nothing at this point until I get a job.
You can.
Yeah,
You
there
could
is
get.
nothing stuff.
You won't get a lot of these tools that are within Logos, but you can use the Faith Life commentary and like the Lexham Bible, which is a really nice translation that you can get for free. And then they'll have a couple. Don't they have like a monthly free resource too? But they're usually like.
Yeah, you can rent some things.
Yeah, but you can get all that stuff. You can get the Faith Life commentary and the Lexham Bible for free. At least those for sure.
And those have timelines?
The Faith Life commentary has timelines within it. Yep.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Uh-oh, we're dropping like flies. There he is.
I knew I shouldn't have started Logos.
That's what I thought you did. I almost said it.
Oh well. I'm gonna say goodnight to the kids, so I'll be right back.
Okay.
So Daniel bailed on us, huh?
I don't know what happened. He might be having internet problems.
I'm surprised he's even joining us with his GRE coming up.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't see him online anywhere, so his internet probably took a turn for the worse. So you guys all gonna see the Moses movie?
Of course.
I didn't know there was one. I don't have any knowledge of what movies are coming out.
Yeah,
Christian Bale, come on now.
It's
I don't even
Batman
know
as
who that
Moses.
is.
He
Christian
played
Bale,
Batman.
Moses.
I didn't really pay attention to Batman either, so I don't really sure who that is. I'm not really into superhero movies.
Yeah, that's why you don't like the Bible.
I just wonder if they're even gonna attempt to be biblically accurate. Probably not.
Well, I'm sure there'll be a little bit of that.
I wonder how it's gonna end. Like, are they gonna end as soon as they cross the Red Sea, or are they gonna end it like at Sinai, or where are they gonna end at the end of the desert? Are they gonna cover the desert wandering?
It'll
Probably not.
probably end with Moses getting drunk because he couldn't get into the Promised Land.
I hope they show the aliens helping to build the pyramids.
Of course. Yeah, I heard that they're trying to take like a rationalist approach to the miracles. Like it's just like natural disasters rather than. But how are they going to do the death of the firstborn? Can't really think of a natural event that would kill all the firstborn children, except for the Israelite children. The other stuff, yeah, it could be natural.
Has anyone here read von Manen's books?
I got the what was his name? Thomas Whitaker book and read that, which covered a lot of von Manen's arguments about the epistles,
Yeah.
which I like. But I haven't. I just recently got Dr. Price's collection of von Manen's stuff. I haven't read it yet, so I just read it basically secondhand through Thomas Whitaker.
The hypercriticism book?
Yeah.
It's still on my to-get list.
I started reading a sample of it today on Kindle. It seems interesting, but the sample didn't really get into the meat of it, so it didn't convince me one way or the other because it was just a sample.
No, it's not a very big book, David. It's a collection of a bunch of his essays, and basically, I think. Grab it. It's got like a foreword by Dr. Price, and then afterward too, I think. Yeah, and I think it's just his writings on. Well, here I'll tell you.
Ah, great, Marcion's bollocks. I'm back.
Welcome back. Yeah, so there's some of his stuff from the Encyclopedia Biblica, the Survey of Old Christian Literature, Gospels, Apocryphal Gospels. Then there's a section on Acts, section on the Epistles, Apocalypses, Apologies, and then Justin's Apologies. Then there's a big section on Paul. Then something on the Epistle to Philemon, Philippians, Romans. Big section on the Church of Rome. Something on Shepherd of Hermas, and that's basically it.
So does he think Philemon's historical or completely fictional?
Philemon?
Yeah, it's one of the shortest epistles there, yeah.
What do you mean, like historical as in Paul wrote it?
Do you think there was a historical, slave? I forget if Philemon was a slave or was the name of somebody else in the story. I forget, but.
Oh, I haven't read that part yet. But I think his general arguments is that all the epistles are not Pauline. Let me see if I can go to that section and see if he's got something.
Who are you talking about?
Von Manen.
Yeah, we're talking about the Epistle to Philemon, whether Philemon was historical. The person that.
I'm very willing to grant that it's historical. I mean, I think making that fictional is kind of. I can get how some of it can be taken allegorically, but it looks historical on the surface, as far as I can tell.
What do you guys think of the Simon Magus theory that he's responsible for most of the writings?
Is that the theory?
I think so.
Well, I've heard that, like, Dettering argues that Paul and Simon Magus are the same person, but is part of the theory too that Simon Magus actually wrote the bulk of the epistles, or someone else did?
I think it's saying that he's responsible for has a role to play in the content more than Paul. I think that's what it's about.
Here for you, Wayne, this is just a little blurb at the beginning on Philemon. There is a surprising mixture of singular and plural, both in the persons speaking and in the persons addressed. This double form points at once to some peculiarity in the composition of the epistle. It is not a style that is natural to anyone who is writing freely and untrammeled, whether to one person or to many.
That's interesting. And that could be the kind of thing that English translations kind of gloss over. So
exactly, yeah.
If I'm not reading it in the Greek and actually paying attention to the Greek, you'll miss that.
Well, that's one of the things that Ehrman has talked about a bunch of times, like when it comes to the differences in the style between like the pastorals and other Paul writings. Like he's like, you don't notice it in English, but in the Greek, like they're just way different. Same with 2 Peter. Like if he's, I think he said, for anyone that can read Greek, it just jumps off the page at you how different they are. That was one of the other questions I had. Like, I don't know if you guys know that the anamusis, or if I'm saying that right, the people taking dictation. I've heard arguments that, oh, well, the reason Second Peter's Greek is so much different is because different anamusis. Well, how much freedom in what the person dictating said versus what ended up on the page did that copier have? Like, were they copying word for word, like a stenographer, or were they just writing down the gist of what the person was saying? You know, how loose was the copying there? Because if they were basically being a stenographer and just writing word for word, then even if, say, Peter was dictating in Aramaic and someone was copying it down in Greek, I still doubt you could get the kind of difference you see, say, between like Romans and Second Peter, or even between First Peter too. So I've always wondered about that. I don't know if you guys know. Probably something I can ask Dr. Price. Because it seems the differences seem to be more than just a different style of translation by an anamusis. But that's one of the common arguments. Yeah, Brian says many scholars consider Second Peter to be the last book written for the New Testament. Not even Eusebius thought Peter wrote it. Yeah, I think the first mention of it is Origen mentions it, and the first thing he says about it pretty much is that it's like highly disputed whether or not Peter wrote it. I think that was the first mention of Second Peter. Or maybe that was the earliest record of its whether or not it was authentic. Yeah, that's some of the things, like, yeah, he refers to Paul's epistles. You guys have probably all heard it on the podcast a zillion times, but yeah, it refers to collection of Paul's epistles, and then there's a preoccupation with the delay of the parousia, and then he says, ever since the fathers fell asleep, he's saying people are saying that, but you know, he would be one of the fathers if he's truly Peter. And then the connection with Jude clearly used First Enoch, and quotes directly from it. And there's tons of Enochic language in Jude. But then Second Peter has a bunch of stuff from Jude too. But there's not as much of the Enochic language in there. So that's why almost all scholars are saying that Second Peter used Jude. So so it probably came after Jude, obviously. Oh, I didn't know that, Ruben. Wow. He says Muratorian canon of about 170 does not even mention First Peter, let alone Second Peter. Now, do we know, Ruben, if Marcion had First and Second Peter, didn't he? He just didn't have the pastorals. He didn't have First, Second Timothy, and Titus.
No, Marcion had his gospel, which is similar to Luke, and he had 10 epistles from Paul. That's it.
Oh, I thought he had all of them except for the pastorals.
No, did not have Hebrews, did not have Revelation, did not have the Johannine epistles, did not have the Petrine epistles. did not have Acts, did not have the other Gospels.
Oh, okay. Wow. Huh. Now, did he have all of Paul's epistles except for the pastorals?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, he didn't have 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, but he had the others.
Okay.
Not including Hebrews, but yeah. Because
Gotcha.
Hebrews is not really Pauline anyway, but
Yeah. Reuben says, on the Muratorian canon, he accepts an epistle of Jude. No mention of 1st, 2nd Peter, or James, though, which is super weird. Because of 2nd Peter's reliance on Jude? Yeah. Yeah, I had some guy who I was talking to about the authenticity of 2nd Peter, and he was trying to argue that, because I showed him a bunch of the verses that are like so similar between between 2nd Peter and Jude, and he's all, well, because at first he was saying that they were just merely had similar themes, and I'm like, well, come on, look at these passages. It's not just theme. There's clearly a literary connection. And so he's like, okay, well, yeah, maybe there's a literary connection, but Jude clearly copied from 2nd Peter. I was like, well, that's weird. So why is it that 2nd Peter doesn't really... there's not a clear use in 2nd Peter of 1st Enoch, whereas it's super clear in the case of Jude. So you'd have to say something like 2nd Peter hinted at hinted at 1st Enoch for some reason, and then Jude noticed that and decided to really use 1st Enoch and use 1st Enoch language. It seems to make way more sense the other way, where 2nd Peter was just using Jude and just used the parts that he wanted from it, so he wasn't concerned about keeping the use of that Enochic language and quotes out of Enoch. But I guess you can't clinch it. So anyway, he didn't really buy my argument at all. He was just adamant Jude used 2nd Peter. That was what he said.
Wow.
Well, anyone got any questions or topics? Or jokes? No puns, Wayne.
I'm just curious, John just said Marcion called Ephesians Laodiceans. Based on what text? What text do we have that are attributed to Marcion?
Probably some church father talking about Marcion said that, I bet. Because we don't have any actual direct writings from Marcion.
I don't know what manuscripts they're in, but we have something called the Marcionite prologues to the Pauline epistles. They're later editions at the beginning of the text that gives a supposed history of the text and what they're from and things. I'm not sure exactly what's all in them, but I know one of the prologues to it calls it Laodiceans. But also from Tertullian and stuff, and Epiphanius tell us that he called it Laodiceans rather than Ephesians.
So, Doug, it doesn't seem to bother you that your puns get under Doug's skin.
Wayne knows I'm just joking with him. I actually
I thought he liked the puns. I thought that's why he didn't want the puns to be waning.
I actually do like puns. I actually consider them to be the highest form of humor.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, after all, they use puns in the Bibles.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not making this up. I'm just serious. I was reading just like a week ago that the government in China is thinking of making a law, or actually already has made a law banning puns in China. Like they're just so sick of people destroying the Chinese language and stuff with puns that they're actually made a law against them.
I would be in favor of that. I was going to say we shouldn't have any puns and hangouts. That's outrageous, Wayne. It's a good thing you don't live in China.
I guess it's just in the news media, I guess, in China they're banning them, but yeah. There's one of the articles, just not the one I originally read, but there's something mentioning it.
It figures you'd be up on the latest news of puns.
Yep.
Here, this for anyone that's interested on the 2 Peter Jude thing, I just stumbled across this. I actually don't know who wrote this. Oh, Mark Edward. So he talks about all the parallel verses between Jude and 2 Peter. And then the uses of 1 Enoch by Jude in a bunch of different places. Well, I don't know if I want to read this. Anyway, it's just an argument that 2 Peter used Jude and not vice versa.
And what's the significance of that?
I'm sorry, did you post it to the side chat? I'm not seeing the link.
Oh, I didn't post a link. Here it is. Just some guy, someone answered a question, and this guy had a good reply that summed it up pretty well. I'll read the last two parts. The parallels with Jude and 1 Enoch are clear, and the parallels with Jude and 2 Peter are clear, and several of those parallels directly overlap. But the parallels between 2 Peter and 1 Enoch are very vague and indirect. If we assume 2 Peter came first and purposely diluted his references to 1 Enoch, we would have to then assume something rather unlikely, that Jude borrowed from 2 Peter. Notice that 2 Peter scrubbed out all direct references to 1 Enoch and then restored them. A far more likely scenario has 2 Peter's hazy verbal and thematic parallels with 1 Enoch explained by 2 Peter being one step removed from the apocryphal book. That 2 Peter was borrowing from 1 Enoch indirectly, so via Jude. The author of Jude made extensive use to 1 Enoch so that the whole epistle is permeated by Enochic language and ideas. Then the author of 2 Peter borrowed from Jude, adding new material and altering the original Enochic sections to suit his purposes. Now, I find that very convincing, personally.
I never realized before this was even a question. I thought it was just obvious that Peter was using Jude.
Well, apparently it's not, because
Yeah.
I was just having a discussion with someone that was trying to tell me that not only is Second Peter authentic, Peter wrote it, but that the only reason there's a literary connection between Jude and Second Peter, which he finally acknowledged, he just said, well, Jude is using Second Peter. But this guy's answer, I think, really he says it really well why that seems very unlikely.
Yeah, I agree with him. But that's one thing I was aware of way back in the day when I was still a Christian, and I had no problem with it back then.
With what problem with what?
With Second Peter using Jude.
What do you mean back when?
Back when I was a Christian still, I mean. Back when I
Oh.
was younger, yeah. I mean, I was aware of it way back then, and it didn't really faze me.
Well, it makes some people uneasy that Jude is so heavily reliant on First Enoch, which is apocryphal.
Yeah.
And really weird.
The Enoch thing I may not have known when I was younger, but
Yeah.
I knew that Chronicles, rewrote things from Samuel and Kings. I knew the Gospels copied from each other, and I knew, Second Peter and Jude had copying.
Reuben says, I know plenty of Christians who believe First Enoch is scripture now. I was going to jokingly ask them, are they all from Ethiopia? Don't they have First and Second Enoch in their canon? Yeah, First Enoch.
So, Doug, you're saying that there's people have reason to believe that Peter actually wrote something in the Bible?
Well, yeah, I mean, the conservative position, the ultra-conservative position is that Peter wrote First and Second Peter.
Yeah, but I don't care about that position. I'm talking about people who know what they're talking about. Most of the stuff I've read is questions his that he wrote any of it.
Well, yeah, I mean, there are professional biblical scholars of the ultra-conservative variety. I'm not talking just like random fundamentalists. I'm talking about like learned scholars who argue that Second Peter is authentic. I mean, they have a really elaborate, rationalizing, in my opinion, to enable to do it, and I think they have an agenda because they don't want to admit that there's forgeries in the canon because they think God's hand had guided the development of the canon. So why on earth would God put forgeries in the canon? So they argue against it.
Yeah, but do you find the argument convincing?
That Second Peter is authentic?
Yeah.
No, not at all. No
I
way.
don't believe Peter existed, so that's my position.
So, okay, but it sounded like you were saying that it was confirmed. What you were saying was confirming the authorship, and I was questioning.
No, it was confirmed. I would say it was confirming its pseudepigraphical status. So it's confirming that Peter did not write it because of its reliance on Jude and the particular way it seems to excise the Enochic stuff from Jude.
Oh, okay.
And the other stuff too, like referring to a collection of Paul's epistles, etc. All that stuff too. What does Dr. Price say? If any book in the New Testament is a forgery, it's Second Peter.
Yep.
What do you think, John Felix? John's ignoring us again. Syriac Bible apparently included the Apocalypse of Baruch, 3-4 Maccabees, 1st, 2nd Esdras. Aren't those the same thing? Apocryphal Psalms and both the Odes and Psalms of Solomon.
You don't have to stay muted. You're probably just muted if you had the mic on when you're making noise when you weren't speaking. It's just a temporary thing. Unmute yourself and go.
We want to hear your soothing tones, John.
His tobacco-laced lungs gives a soothing sound.
Oh, I don't know who muted you, John, but I think you were echoing at one point. It's amazing that anyone would accept Acts of Paul and Thecla.
Yeah, I think that's interesting about the Syriac Bible. It included also one codex included the sixth book of Josephus. So I want that to be scripture too.
Did it really?
Yeah, which really throws things up into an uproar as trying to figure out what's canonical and not in those ancient Syriac churches, because apparently they included whatever the heck they wanted. So the inclusion of certain books might not necessarily mean that they were considered scripture.
Yeah, exactly. It might be something like just a collection, like Nag Hammadi. Who knows how much of that they considered like holy scripture? Do they consider the Odyssey or whatever? Or what do they have? The part of the Odyssey in there, or something like that?
Could have even been the pastor's private library and not even used during services.
Right. Yeah. That was the other point. Is that obviously these weren't not meant to be church Bibles. Apparently.
Some of the things we know for sure they were meant to be a collection of scripture, though, right? Like the Muratorian canon, that wasn't merely just a collection of writings, right? It was meant to be a canon of scripture, wasn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Someone's idea of canon.
But I mean, the goal wasn't to just have a collection of relevant writings, right? I mean,
Well, it was just a fragment or something. I think that had a list written on it, wasn't that all?
Yeah.
Probably just someone's ancient to read list.
Or, these should be banned, but that part got cut off.
Thanks, David.
That's even funnier. Yep, a to-ban list.
Yeah, that would be too long. Every book in the Library of Alexandria would be on the ban list.
I think they were. That's what happened to them.
You know that there's not a single bit of that building that we've ever discovered. There's no archaeological evidence whatsoever that we have of it. I'm not saying it
Was it
didn't
underwater?
exist.
I didn't know that. I'm gonna
I
have to
don't
work
know.
on it. I'm gonna have to work on a theory that it didn't exist.
No, I'm not. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying it's just weird that we have nothing from it.
A place of that importance, you know, if it did exist, we'd have evidence.
I think, well, for one thing, obviously they're not sure of the location, but I guess there's a couple of locations that they're recently started excavating, or they're gonna start excavating where they think it may have been. They're hoping to find some evidence of it.
That's actually good news in a way, though, because I hate for them to have found it but not found manuscripts. So that that they haven't found the building still leaves me some hope that we might actually find remains of some sort of manuscripts or tablets or something still there.
Yeah. Well, we found like the annex of it, like an annex library that was built with it, but we haven't found the main building.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
What building is this?
Library of Alexandria.
Wow, that's surprising, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. And there was a library, I forget where it was. Ruben will probably know. I want to say Ephesus, but somewhere in Turkey. And they were, yeah, Pergamum, thanks. They were competing with each other. You know, that's one of the reasons we have the Codex, because eventually they would stop sending papyrus to the Library of Alexandria. Had so many more books, they would stop sending out papyrus to Pergamum because they didn't, you know, want to them to get as big of a collection. So eventually at Pergamum they started going, okay, well, we can't get papyrus, and then eventually they just had to start using vellum. And the best, you know, vellum can't roll up like a scroll can. So they ended up just putting them into codices, and that's how we basically got our book, because of that fight
That's
between
fascinating.
between the two libraries. Yeah, and at the Library of Alexandria, all incoming ships to the ports would be searched for books, and if there were any books on the boats, they'd be confiscated, copied, okay, and then once they were done copying all the books, they would return the copies to the ship owners. They kept the originals for themselves. During one of the Ptolemies' reigns, I think it was. Oh no! It was way after that, I think. Yeah, way after that. I forget. I think it was built under one of the Ptolemies. Ptolemy the First, maybe? I don't remember. And then they built that other. That's, you know, that's one of the wonders of the ancient world. And then one of the other ones they built too was that famous lighthouse, which that we actually have the foundation of still. There's like a fort. I think the Muslims eventually ended up building a fort on top of the foundation of the lighthouse of Alexandria. But the foundation of the fort is the foundation of the lighthouse, so they use the same blocks and everything. Same stones. Oh, is that it, Reuben? Yeah, okay, cool. Citadel at Kite Bay? Kite Bay? I don't know how to say that. Qaitbay. Anyway, not really related to the Bible, but interesting.
Yeah, I guess all of us need to start reading the Bible more so we have more questions.
Yeah, I actually haven't been, I listen to it at work, an audio Bible of the NASB, and I just started maybe 4 or 5 days ago going through Joshua, but I only got to the part where like Rahab is talking about Rahab and the spies, and they just crossed the river Jordan with the ark, and that's as far as I've gotten. So I need to get back to it. Did you read them all, David? All the church fathers, or just the pre-Nicene ones? Oh, you have to, yeah. Yeah, me too. I need to read Josephus, church fathers, and then like a zillion biblical scholarship books. Yeah, I want to read Philo too. I want to read the Gospel of John and then read Philo, or vice versa.
Or back and forth 2 and 3 times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, eventually. Okay, Ruben has a good reading schedule, recommended reading schedule. Josephus, Origen, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, then the Apostolic Fathers, then the Nicene Fathers, post-Nicene Fathers, Augustine. That makes sense.
That for another hangout? I'll read.
Yeah, let's all read the complete works of Josephus by next Bible Geek Hangout.
No, but I mean, maybe like a couple chapters a week, for the next like 5 years and go through all this stuff.
Yeah. Where would you throw Philo in there, Ruben? Would you even put him in there? No? That would just be supplementary reading. Would you have a recommended reading schedule for Reformation era, important Reformation era writings? He says yes. I'm actually going to copy this down and I'm going to follow it when I start reading Josephus. Schedule 1.
Yeah, to read as much stuff as I actually wish would have already read, I'd have to be reading like a book a week for for the rest of my life.
How do you say that first guy? Hus? Hus? Start with Calvin and Luther, then their precursors and disciples. That would be Huss, Zwingli, Melanchthon, Knox. Follow it up with the later reformers like Jacobus, Arminius, and the counter-reformers.
Yeah, I probably wouldn't read with you on those. That time period does not actually interest me that much.
Oh, really? I'm like that.
Yeah.
That's one of the very interesting time periods to me. I mean, that's a critical era in the history of Christian belief.
It is, but by that time things were already so set in the wrong paths that
Mm-hmm.
it no longer interests me at that point.
Yeah, and I can easily see like being interested in the formative years versus
Yeah.
a reimagining or reevaluation of Christian theology.
I'm with Wayne on that one.
Well, I'm copying both, and I'm gonna follow them.
It'll be a while till
I'll
I
report
catch.
back to you guys next week once I've read it all by the end of next week.
I need to read Gilgamesh first, so.
Yeah, I need to read those too. I read big chunks of the Epic of Gilgamesh before, and I read the Enuma Elish a long, long time ago, but I've forgotten almost. The Enuma Elish is pretty short. It's only a couple tablets.
Yeah, I read that a couple months ago when we were doing the Legends in Genesis Hangout.
Oh yeah.
Didn't really study it though.
I heard something today on the Bible Geek podcast that, oh gosh, what was it? It was on. He mentioned Gunkel again, but it was a New Testament thing. I wish I could remember what the question was about.
Yeah, I don't actually listen to him. I just put him up.
Did I just hear blasphemy?
I can't listen to all that stuff. I mean, jeez, got other stuff to do.
I haven't listened to them all either. I was kidding.
Ruben
I
listens.
wish I had time to though.
Ruben listens to all of them, doesn't he?
Me too. This is my second go-through, my second go-around. Except Reuben probably remembers some like crazy. I don't.
Are there any primary points that you disagree with Price, Doug?
Well, I'm not a mythicist, but I'm open to that possibility. So I don't know if I necessarily disagree with him, but that's not saying much coming from someone like me, though. I mean, he's just infinitely more knowledgeable.
Well, Price would say the same thing. He doesn't like calling himself a mythicist either. He just says, it's slightly more probable, but he talks about historicist theories all the time.
Yeah, that's true.
What is it about the mythicist position that you find problematic?
Well, I'm not convinced that Paul is talking about a celestial or heavenly Jesus, and that all this, that he was crucified by the principalities and powers, that's referring to like some level of heaven, and that it's all taking place in some level of heaven. I'm not convinced by that. I mean, I'm saying I'm open to the possibility, but it's not convincing to me. And then I think that Reuben has talked to me about this before too, but I think in some ways, the thing they do with the brother of Jesus stuff, I almost feel like there can be like apologists a little bit, saying, well, it doesn't necessarily mean brother. Well, that sounds like apologetics to me a little bit. But again, it's possible.
There's an abundance of places in the Bible, though, where the term brother is used for not for genetic brothers, but just for fellow Christians. It's just all through the New Testament. So, I mean, even though that one particular passage doesn't
Yeah, but that's not the only passage.
doesn't look that way, but yeah.
You got Josephus saying it too. There's several places.
The Josephus passage, we talked about this before, puts him in the wrong decade, which makes it really problematic in my mind. So.
Yeah.
The whole mythicist position for me just seems too sinister for a group of people to fabricate this elaborate mythology that ended up, revolutionizing the world. It just doesn't make sense to me. I totally get that, there could be legends that were created, around the admiration of Jesus. I get that, but just the whole purist mythicist position to me just seems too sinister to be real.
I don't think it's sinister. I think just a gradual evolution. I think the standard traditional view of the rise of Christianity actually has it arising too fast. And I think the trends that develop into Christianity actually go back centuries farther than they're usually traced.
There are different forms of mythicism. Some are conspiratorial, definitely, and some aren't.
I think it's just the Jewish practice of trying to understand why God's letting things happen the way they happen. Why is Rome taking over Canaan and stuff? It doesn't seem fair to them, and why would God allow that? Well, the Old Testament always talked about them being under Babylonian and Assyrian rule and stuff. So it's been interpreted under the same lines, but still. But when the temple is destroyed, the Jews have to explain, well, how do we keep doing, what rituals and laws are we supposed to keep now we don't have the temple? And I think the development of Christianity was just part of Jews trying to find their own identity, and it's just one path they took.
Since Kushod is what I'm working on today, I remember reading some stuff. So in the very beginning of the book, he summarizes, it is objected that the history of Christian origins must begin with the life of Jesus. I shall attempt to answer this objection and propose what, if I am not mistaken, has not yet been attempted. That is to outline a history of Christianity not without a Jesus, but with a Jesus kept on that spiritual plane, which is outside historic fact and unmeasured by time, and which is really his own. The story of Jesus is mingled with that of Christianity. The notion of Jesus came into existence with the germination of a new theology in a Jewish mind. Jesus grew in spasms as this new theology gained ground till it became capable of converting a world.
Yeah, I like that.
I just want to read what Reuven wrote. Adelphos doesn't mean brother. Adelphos is used in the New Testament more for brother in Christ over biological. Even in the Old Testament, all references to cousins, half-brothers, and step-brothers are rendered Adelphos. Reuven, what do you think, though, about where in Paul, where he says that he's listing a bunch of the pillars, and then he singles out James as being the brother? So why aren't all of them listed as Adelphos?
Yeah, I agree with that question.
If they're all just brothers in Christ.
It sounds to me like it's being used as a title.
Yeah, but is Adelphos used as a title, as an honorific, above and beyond other people?
I would say he is saying it's a title.
But I mean, it possibly is a title, but how do we know if it is? What can we bring to bear that could sway us from pure agnosticism on whether it's a title or biological reference? Because it seems to me that both are equally plausible, aren't they? unless there's some outside factors that can be brought to bear to establish that it's a title versus a biological reference.
Yeah, I get what you're saying, Doug, and I don't know how to answer it.
Well, my take on it is exactly the same as, say, like Earl Doherty, I think, where I think the entire passage saying Josephus is about Jesus ab Damnaeus. Somebody just interpolated Jesus, the brother of the so-called Christ or whatever. That reference, I think, is interpolation. I know people don't like that, but I think it is.
Yeah, that relates to my problem with that passage referring to the wrong decade to be referring to Jesus that we want to talk about.
Yeah, I'm open to that possibility for the Josephus thing. I don't have a problem with that. But for Paul, I can see the Paul quote. I can see it going either way. Like, is there any other example of that title honorific being used for anybody? Was it exclusive to James? I mean, because it could be a biological reference. We don't know. I mean, so why would we prefer one over the other? You see what I'm saying? Anyway, the other thing
He gets
too.
to stay muted and I don't.
Sorry.
He gets to be muted and not answer, and I don't.
Were you muted again, John?
No, I'm just saying. I was earlier.
Oh. The other thing too, which you and I, John, have talked about, is that you go from mythical to historical to, or legend, from legend to history back to legend again, which I guess is possible, but again, it seems kind of strained. I don't know.
Didn't Dr. Price discuss that in one of the Hangouts when he finally popped in one time?
Yeah, he did talk. Yeah, he did talk about that. Yeah.
You remember what he said? Because I have to listen to it 5 or 6 times before I ever remember anything.
I think it was basically that it's really not that implausible because of the particular evolution of the process in this case, something like that. I'm probably slaughtering his words, but I think that was the basic argument. And I think he brought in some references to other cases where something similar has happened, but I don't remember the specifics. I'll have to go back and listen to that now that you said that because I forgot he had talked about that. You think you brought it up?
I don't know if he brought it up or I did. I can't remember. But I know it was discussed for at least a short time anyway.
Yeah, I think you did bring it up because the night before, or the last hangout, I think we were talking about that problem, and then I think he popped in and you asked him about it.
Well, I'm just like roaming through my mind over all his books, and I can't think of any example that I've ever heard him writing about. Because that seems, I think I remember stuff I read more than I hear, that of any case like that. You know, he might have mentioned, that one guy. I think it was Savittai Svi or somebody who was a historical person and then mythologized. Which, I was going along with that argument and deconstructing Jesus, and then it's like, when he had to do the opposite argument, how do you go from a mythical person to a historical person? It's like, I never got a concrete argument that I could have put my finger on to say, that explains it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I still don't think I've gotten it.
Didn't like Romulus or one of those Roman guys undergo something similar to that? I think Romulus started out like purely mythical and then kind of got historicized. Maybe I'm thinking of someone else though. Don't quote me on that.
It could have been.
But again, you have to have the 3-part there in the case of Jesus.
Are you denying the historicity of Romulus and Remus?
I think I would, yeah.
What, there couldn't have been 2 guys founded the Roman city? city of Rome?
Well, here's what I'll say. There could have been a historical Romulus, but if there was, he's been so covered up by legend that he's lost to history. Sound familiar?
Okay, pick a historical Romulus that you favor. Do you favor the apocalyptic preacher Romulus or the zealot Romulus or what?
The planet.
Yeah, the enemies of the Federation.
Yeah, that's true, Reuven, but didn't he undergo some kind of historicizing process? I thought he did. I could be thinking of someone else. I mean, it wasn't as extensive, obviously, as ostensibly happened to Jesus, but
From what little I remember about Roman history, that does seem to be a good fit for an example. Yeah. Anyway. Because it would just be a process of mythical Romulus being historicized as an actual founder and then later on being seen as a demigod or a god in some form later on. So it would be like similar to that.
yeah. But again, I'm not like anti-mythicist. I think it's possible for sure. I don't even think it's a crazy idea. I just think there's some issues with it. But then again, I barely know anything about all these topics, so my opinion's not worth that much.
Oh, there was one other thing I wanted to read from this book. He talks about the Old Testament history, how critics have been easy to and quick to say that Eden, Cain, and Abel, the flood, all that stuff is not historical. But then he goes on to talk about Christianity. The work of dissociation of the sacred history of Christianity is more difficult than the dissection of Judaism. The critics are not yet unanimous in recognizing that the story of Jesus as a whole must be transferred from the plane of facts to that of beliefs. Many have been misled, as I see it, by a false historical analogy to imagine that Christianity is no more explicable without the man Jesus than is Islam without the man Muhammad. They fail to perceive that Muhammad is a prophet, whereas Jesus, from the earliest texts we have referring to him, is God, a face, a mask, a person of the divine unity. The difference is of capital importance. Judeo-Christian theology allows no passage from the human state to the divine, and the deification of a man by Jewish monotheists is highly improbable. There is good ground for regarding Jesus from the viewpoint of history as entirely divine, i.e. as a poetic creation in the wide sense of the word. And what I read earlier was right after that.
Interesting. Yeah, Reuven convinced me of Muhammad mythicism in about 10 minutes, chatting with him on Facebook.
Give us a 5-minute version.
I thought of that before Reuven was learning to spell his name.
So there you go. I'm not against mythicism. I'm a disciple of Reuven for Muhammad mythicism.
Short version of the Muhammad mysticism case.
Well, for one thing, was it Medina or one of the really important cities was not even, yeah, Mecca was not at all a city at the time. It would have had to have been during Muhammad's time. Then there's some question as to his descendants or his, something with his genealogy. I forget the details that Reuben brought up. A bunch of stuff. I forget the details now. I just remember that at the time I was like, wow, this is really convincing. I forget all the details, though, a lot of them.
At least I'm not the only one who gets convinced about things. And then when people ask me why I'm convinced, I can't remember what to tell them. That always embarrasses me when I'm in that position.
Yeah, but I mean, you know, I see what you're saying, but at the same time, like, if you're not an expert, something can sound convincing to you, and you can forget the details of why it was convincing, but you can still remember that you felt convinced.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Just every book I read, I feel like I'm convinced until I stop reading it, at least. Sometimes
Or
not even then.
or read another book from the other side of the fence, and then that convinces you, and then you just bounce back and forth.
Yeah, until my head explodes.
Well, you know what that's saying, right?
I'm
That there's,
wishy-washy.
well, no, it just, well, maybe that, but probably more like the field is not so cut and dried, or the evidence is not so cut and dried, you know?
Oh, so it's like, it's reality where the problem is. It's not me. Thank you.
Exactly, yeah.
Whew.
Man, that's how I feel more and more just about the whole Jesus question. Like,
Jesus is the
just
answer.
it's such a big problem, and we're so cut off from that time period. It's just like, oh,
Yeah, Dr. Price's agnosticism. We'll never know.
pretty much, yeah, pretty much. How could we? Like he says, how could we without a time machine? We can never definitively say one way or the other.
Well, the point of history is just to put things in their most probable context, though, right?
Right. But even then, we're so far removed from those events and the pedigree of these writings that even if we can make a probabilistic judgment, it's not going to be, one side's not going to be way more probable than the other necessarily. Just because the evidence, the state of the evidence itself is kind of up in the air.
Yeah, well, at least it's better than possibilities. I mean, anything's
Yeah.
possible. But yeah, like you said, the accumulation of evidence could tend to tilt things in favor of one viewpoint over another.
Yeah, I mean, without that hope, I mean, we're just spinning our wheels here. What's the point?
Well, most things, if you look at most books that come out, they endlessly go over the same evidence, just with different interpretations, or trying to get new things out of the available evidence. Like, oh, maybe you've never noticed this before. So yeah, but it all boils down to different ways of looking at the same stuff. So it's not until you really get new evidence that you can overturn a paradigm, I think, in favor of one or the other.
The biggest thing I find attractive about mythicism is that seems to have been this trend in Judaism leading up to the time of Jesus of like this, like a kind of a Jewish mystic, I guess, idea. I could be mischaracterizing the category there, but of this like suffering servant type of figure. Like I think it was in Fourth Maccabees or one of the Maccabees books. I remember coming across something like, wow, that sounds just like Jesus. Like there seems to have been in the back maybe 3 centuries or so, and then leading up to that date, the idea was in the air kind of as like a suffering servant. Obviously that's from Isaiah, but that idea seemed to have been really like in the air. It was part of the zeitgeist of the times, or whatever the term is.
Yeah, Cusho, who I now have a man crush on, besides Thomas L. Thompson, is the first sections are all about these apocalypses, like Daniel, Enoch, Moses, and then that section of John the Baptist I wrote. But yeah, to me, I don't even really, and somebody wrote this in the Bible Geek listeners like a month ago or so. But I feel the same way. I really don't care whether Jesus was historical or not. That's not, to me, the central issue. I want to know about Christian origins. And to me, it's just more interesting to try to figure out whether you can explain Christianity and its origins without a Jesus. So it's just a working hypothesis to me, so I'm not married to the idea of whether he's historical or not. I'm just working from what can you say and can you explain the evidence that's existing, without a historical Jesus. I think you can, but that doesn't make it truer than the opposite hypothesis.
Yeah, and the other, I agree with that, and that I think that's the strongest case for mythicism is that trend in Judaism. But the other thing too is like, well, when you're looking at whether Jesus is historical or not, you could equally just say that. I mean, on the one hand, you could say that Jesus, the character of Jesus, was a creation that embodied this idea that was in the air, or you could say there was a historical Jesus. We don't know much about his life, and then his life was interpreted heavily in terms and from the perspective of this pre-existing idea that sounds so much like the Jesus we now have. The historical Jesus' life was interpreted through that lens, and that's why it sounds like that.
Yeah, and I just think we just can't make a determination one way or the other. I mean, it's just fun to do one way or another, I guess. So I allow other people's viewpoints, under consideration of myself, because I know that I'm not proving there was no historical Jesus, nor can I prove that Christianity necessarily came out of just a mixture of different trends, but it's interesting to investigate that. And it's more than just certain ideas. It's a mishmash of ideas, interactions, and mutations of ideas when they meet, because there are some different ideas that can come together. Like you mentioned, the suffering servant. Once that meets the other kind of Jesus, the more apocalyptic Son of Man type Jesus, when those ideas come together and mesh in the minds of different communities and social groups, and that's when interesting stuff happens.
Yeah, I agree. And it is hard to decide one way or the other, just because, I mean, we're just too far removed.
Well, there's also, I read somewhere where there's a Greek influence here, and I forget the term or the context of it, but it has something to do with in the Hellenistic mindset that they were open to, or at least valued, this concept of I won't say divine human, but like a superhuman was a part of the Greek culture. That's what made Paul's reaching out to them so effective, is they already had sort of a concept or a value placed on the superhuman.
I have a question. Do you think Apollonius of Tyana is based on Jesus or based on earlier ideas from a common source?
I personally am agnostic on that question too.
Yeah, I don't know much about Apollonius of Tyana, but it's an avenue that I need to research one of these days because it seems highly relevant.
I've heard people say that the Jesus-sounding stuff is all post-Jesus, but the figure himself predates Jesus. And then I've heard that, well, no, the Jesus-sounding stuff does predate Jesus, so I don't know.
Even if it was contemporary, you could say that similar things could have arisen in totally different areas without influencing each other. That happens.
Yeah, that could happen, but you'll never convince an apologist of that.
Well, no, it can't be, because the Jesus story has to be unique.
So
either it has to come first, or it has to be the influence of other things.
Exactly. So that's not it's interesting as a historical question, but it's not really useful for talking to Christians. Which I'm not saying should be our goal. I'm just throwing it out there.
Well, I try not to hang out in any of Nadia's hangouts, because then you're going to end up talking to Christians.
Mm-hmm. Well, of that certain sort. Sorry, Kevin?
There was a few things I wanted to mention from what Frank was bringing up and what a lot of you have been sort of kind of touching on. And obviously this is coming from my perspective as a student of Greek religion. there were demigods. I mean, that was a cultural concept that's fairly specific to Greek, in the same way that, say, avatars are specific to Vedic and Hindu religion. Very particular to the mythologies and how that concept was understood. And there were lots of thinkers and leaders and teachers of various philosophical schools that had this sort of idea that in more general Western and European terms would be almost like a sacred kinship, where they are sons of a particular deity. Even if not literally so, it's done so almost metaphorically, as if to suggest that they have the essence of said God in what they're doing and what they're trying to portray. But more importantly, and this goes for pretty much all of the things that we could discuss in the post-classical world, the Hellenistic period, that period it saw so much syncretism, so much intermingling of the Greek and the Egyptian and the Phoenician and the Jewish, and it was a mess. I mean, there were so many different sorts of evolutions of thought. Looking even just at Neoplatonism, the development of that from one thinker to another was immense. If you were to compare Plotinus to Iamblichus even, I mean, there's huge differences in the way they saw their cosmology. And they all thought that they were basing their ideas on Plato. And I mean, talking about differences, I mean, Plotinus alone was vastly different than Plato. And then looking at the Pythagoreans and Orphic religion, there was a whole host of different sorts of philosophical threads. It's often called the golden thread, extending well back into pre-classical history. So, I mean, and we don't fully understand all of those sorts of influences. So when you're talking about the things that kind of go into the Christ figure, it's a complicated area of study. I mean, there are whole areas of study dedicated to just the character of Jesus alone, more or less the actual history behind it, which is far more, I mean, it's tip of the iceberg when you really get down to it. There's so many different sorts of schools of thought that were all competing with one another. The Neoplatonists hated the Gnostics hated the Neoplatonists. You had early Christian groups. You had the Marcions. You had Hermetic thought, early Pythagorean. You had Stoics. I mean, you had all these things going on in the same time within the period of only a few hundred years. So,
yeah, and the Cynics.
Yeah, the Cynics, late Cynics, but yeah.
Yeah, we're all open to that idea of multiple streams all feeding into each other and mixing around and stuff. Although there are groups that aren't.
And you see strong evidences of this in the things that came out of it in the Renaissance and in the Victorian age with modern Western esoteric tradition, which is an even bigger mixture of different sorts of things. It kind of carried on this tradition of cultural syncretism, very much going underground and forming occult orders and the like, having completely divergent perspectives on who the figure of Jesus was.
Would you say that a lot of these underground cults were just left no trace?
You had to know somebody. Really?
Because a lot of stuff I read by like what scholars that consider themselves mainstream biblical scholars, they deny that there's any kind of major influence, like you're describing, that the Jews were uniquely isolated from syncretism.
Crazy.
Yeah.
So crazy.
I mean,
well, that's what I think.
There were cultural syncretisms going on in early Judaism. I mean, excessive amounts. I mean, just look at any demonology study. The sorts of entities that were incorporated into Jewish mythology. They are coming from several different tribes, attributed to certain different levels of power, authority, or maligned in certain ways for specific reasons because of cultural interactions that they had with people over several centuries.
Well, isn't the fact just that the New Testament is written in Greek a good reason to assume acculturation?
Oh yes, especially considering that the development of Koine was very much a part of that specific period. its development was because of that period. Lots of changes that happened from early classical Greek were to standardize Greek, to make it easier to speak. There's a lot of eccentricities to classical Greek that aren't present, especially not present in modern Greek.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of Hellenistic influence even on earlier Jewish culture, going back, to the time of the Seleucids, and that
No,
maybe even before that, because a lot of even, the Talmud and the Mishnah and that record styles of writing and groups of scholars getting together, seems to come from a Hellenistic background rather than being like something that just sprang out of Judaism.
Well, speaking of the Seleucid Empire and all the sorts of things that they developed, another thing that's often just overlooked in this conversation is Babylon and Assyria. The Akkadian language, that culture, their technological advances, their concepts of astronomy and astrology, of medicine, a lot of these things, many cultures in that area were taken from them. Not just the Greeks, and not even just the Egyptians, but also clearly early Jews.
Yeah, just the idea or the proposition that Jews, to use Dr. Price's term, were hermetically sealed, even though they were at the center, well, maybe not the center, but deep in this, geographically deep into this, crossroads of tons of different stuff swirling around like crazy. I mean, the idea that they didn't pick up any of that just seems so implausible to me. I just can't even entertain it. And then the fact that we can see it too just totally destroys it. I mean, we can see the influence.
Well, we can also see the influence from its contrast. How Jewish thought actually influenced other belief systems.
Yeah.
So it goes both directions.
Definitely.
Others.
It goes all directions.
The development of Zoroastrianism, development obviously of Christianity, and many forms of Gnosticism, we can clearly see were definitely influenced by Jewish thought, and the opposite has to be true.
Yeah.
It's impossible for something else to influence another without there to be any sort of residue. It just doesn't happen in social systems.
And there's other modes of assimilation too. It's not just exchanging ideas, but also seeing other ideas and rejecting them and writing or taking a polemical view of what these other cultures are presenting. So they're influencing you also in a negative way.
Mm-hmm.
You can see a lot of this influence in very mundane aspects, such as technology. One of the first weapons that was created was a sort of axe blade that was used by the ancient Sumerians. When the Egyptians adopted it, it was the khopesh, and they enculturated it in such a manner that it became a part of the identity of Egyptian rulers, that it became Egyptian, even though it was clearly something that a much, much earlier culture developed. The Greeks were doing very much the same thing in a lot of their ideas. They would adopt something and Hellenize it. They would make it uniquely Greek while still knowing that it was coming from these earlier cultures. A lot of that is lost to us in modern times because some of that aspect was not really written down. We only have hints of their views of other cultures and the way those cultures viewed them. Those are eccentricities of history that really require a deep level of study.
What's interesting too, though, I think it was Plato or one of the Greek philosophers was saying that nothing the Greeks have came from Greece. It all, like, I think that a lot of them say it came from everything Greek came initially from Egypt or some other place. You know what I mean?
And
so,
a better way of looking at it is that the core mythological framework, the cosmothesis, the worldview, is uniquely Greek and traces back to earlier European systems. But the aesthetic, the development, the refinement of that system was definitely evidenced through Egyptian and Babylonian and many of the other different cultures that were in the area like the Thracians, the Phrygians, the Hittites, and even northern peoples, the Celts. There was constant influx going on there. And that's usually the case with most cultures. They have a core framework, and then they sort of take in things in the way that a plant takes in nutrients from the soil.
Yeah.
They could also take in similar ideas. Other cultures can take similar ideas, say like Persia, I think influenced both Greece and the Jews by their concepts of, for instance, the eschaton and linear history. I think those ideas, the Greeks were exposed to it, they ran with it one way, and the Hebrews ran with it a different way. But they both, drew from that idea, which previously before it was more like secular history.
Yes. But it all sort of comes down to resources, whether it's informational resources or technological resources. Persia, and because of the Persian Empire, there were many roads that were built. There were many structures and frameworks that were built because of that empire, sometimes in spite of other cultures, but it had a monumental influence on the cultures in the area. One that went back and forth, especially amongst the Greeks, from a certain degree of appreciation to outward hostility towards the Persians, hence the war.
Even though they're antagonistic, they still were exchanging ideas,
Yes.
whether they wanted to or not, because of the opening of trade routes and things like that.
Nothing is created, nothing is interacted upon in a vacuum. Not every single Persian hated every single Greek. So.
Just 300 of them.
Yeah, and you see perfect evidences of this with Jewish esotericism, like that of the Kabbalah. Many Kabbalists view it as something that's uniquely Jewish and that is only meant to be shared with other Jews who are much older. Yet it's clear that the Kabbalah was shared with the Greeks. And because of that, there are many, many, many different permutations of that esoteric doctrine throughout the centuries leading into modern day. Because not every single Jew felt that way. If that makes sense.
John, I was thinking you posted something in Facebook recently about the Septuagint writers may have had a more of a creative hand in writing down the legends that were formerly considered to be part of early Jewish history, but were actually, there's some evidence that they were created, much later. So I'm thinking of the Greek, if they're Greek writers putting the Septuagint together and these redactors, or however they're agreeing to record these stories that have been around for centuries, they may have had an influence in how they were told because they were, it was a later period and being influenced by the Greeks.
Yeah, because some of the things, like in the book we were reading Sunday, the Bible on Earth, they tended to locate everything in the time of Josiah, that a lot of the more older tales seem to fit better a later period. But I thought that not only that period, but also the period of the Maccabees and Hasmoneans were also a good fit too for some of those stories. So what I was thinking of in general was that the legend of how the Septuagint came about is kind of like an inverted form of the way it actually occurred, that Jews had brought with them the sources, what biblical scholars think of as in source criticism as, JEPD. They brought those individual sources with them to Egypt and then combined them there into a literary form, and a lot of their models that they had for constructing Jewish history was based on their access to the writings in, say, like the Library of Alexandria, Hellenistic writings, and other earlier cultures, because they probably had stuff from a lot of different earlier cultures as well.
Right. Well, that's an interesting aspect to it. I'm just wondering, how those stories were spun. Like, what element of it was actually a Greek concept rather than a Jewish one.
Well, for one thing, the impetus to write a history of a people's was a very Hellenistic thing to do. A lot of the thinkers at the time, like the 2nd and 3rd century BC, seemed to want to know the history of various peoples that they came in contact with. So they would like to say, okay, tell us about your histories, or show us the writings of your histories if you're a literate people. And that the Jews at one time decided that they also needed to have a body of literature that reflected their ancient history. So the initial impetus was itself initially started by their contact with Hellenization.
Mhm.
And then the models that they used were those available to them at the time, some that we know of, probably some we don't.
Yeah.
For instance, the writings of Manetho and Berosus, and that was the reference to that book that we had mentioned, I think, on Sunday. What was it? Berosus in Genesis and Manetho in Exodus.
I think there's another aspect too that should be clarified about, especially Hellenistic thought compared to the earlier Greek and Egyptian, as largely it was a Greco-Egyptian period, and what largely highlighted that period was the concept of a mystery tradition or mystery school, which is really a more esoteric development of a philosophical school. In earlier classical Greek, philosophy was something that all people engaged in, and the Hellenistic period was no different. But it was largely viewed as a natural extension of the actual indigenous cultural tradition. It was something that somebody would choose as a sort of avenue to explore within their existing culture. So as mystery traditions developed, very much that same context was there. Most people would have had their own indigenous cultural tradition that they would have continued to practice, especially in their homes, as a household cult was fundamental to most of the people in the area, irrespective of being Greek, Egyptian, or from the Near East. But they would adopt a mystery tradition as a sort of ancillary practice, as a secondary or even tertiary practice from the various sorts of religious and philosophical pursuits that they would have had, oftentimes requiring certain degrees of capital, if not, certain degrees of information from which they would have been able to initiate themselves into those schools. So I think with that bearing in mind, something that's often not addressed is what actually made the transition between these earlier polytheistic cultures having mystery schools that they adopted versus what became of Christian orthodoxy transforming itself from a mystery school to something that you needed to commit to completely, wholeheartedly, and in every aspect of life, with a strong ecclesia, despite the fact that many of the early Christian denominations, if you could even call them that, didn't have a central ecclesia, and they weren't orthodox in the way that we would consider them.
In a way, to me, that the answer is like contained in that, because you were talking about increase in authority. No, sorry, wrong word. But anyway, there's the hierarchy, there's the development of orthodoxy and right belief and stuff like. It seems like there was a movement in that particular period of history that went towards authoritarianism. That's the word I was looking for. But it's hard.
And much of that is reflected in the development of those various schools. Using Neoplatonic and Hermetic ideas as a template for what I'm about to say here, they developed more and more towards the aspect of a unified oneness above all things. The one originally in Plato's thought and in Plotinus was more of a philosophical and meditative aspect. But as it progressed further and further leading up into Christian ideas, there became a much more sophisticated cosmological aspect, often fusing different elements together. Many of the later Neoplatonic schools, Hermetic thought, Gnostic schools started to resemble each other more and more and more. So there seems to be a gradual sort of point of egress that many of these schools and forms of thought did, with Orthodox Christianity being the sort of end result of all of that sort of, to use a modern occult term, meta-paradigming of those aspects, that there was something higher than all the other things that was in the area, and this was the core truth, this was the core authority and hierarchy that we need to be subservient to.
Okay. I think I got what you said.
To kind of clarify what I was saying, there's a term that's often used in a lot of esoteric circles. It's called a meta-paradigm. Paradigm is basically a worldview or a belief system. The concept of a meta-paradigm is something that supersedes existing belief systems, that is designed for the specific purposes of either unifying or going above any of those particular sorts of eccentricities in belief system. An example of this, for instance, would be esoteric Hermetic Kabbalah, which is meant to unify all of these sorts of different belief systems together. Another example of that, obviously, would be the concept of the Holy Trinity in Christianity, which is meant to unify all of these different disparate Christian concepts, despite the fact that there are many different Christian schools and opinions about what the Trinity is. Most of them, post conversion, were considerably more Trinitarian in nature.
Okay, yeah, I wasn't sure what you meant by meta-paradigm. I was thinking of something also a little bit more concrete, is like the Eucharist, where if you're talking about mystery religions, in a sense that's like a watered-down mystery, because, you're not exactly sure how the heck bread and wine become flesh and blood, but, it's not, it's maybe it was designed to kind of like be a half measure, a meeting place for different groups that might need something, some point of unification.
I actually,
in certain types of people too, mystic type people.
I actually feel that what a lot of Christianity has done over the centuries is owned mysticism. They've taken it upon themselves as something that only the authority of the church can provide. So anything that is outside of that, of the authority of church, whether in home or in individual philosophy, is viewed as anathema to that authority. So mysticism itself is discouraged, yet it's clearly present in Christian doctrine. So
and it's allowed to be practiced by an elite group. An inner group, there's like an inner mystery and an outer mystery still, although it doesn't quite take the same form as the earlier mystery religions would do that.
Or the modern ones that extended from those earlier traditions that we see now in the modern day in alternative spirituality. So yes, absolutely. But I think it's just an interesting perspective to take to study some of these more heterodoxical kind of systems that were going on that largely fell to the wayside or would completely dissolve, because they really do help to put the formation of Christian doctrine into proper perspective.
Oops. Sorry. Did I do something?
I think you added a Hangout toolbox.
Sorry about that.
No, don't worry about it.
All it was a blue message and nothing else.
I hate to be so intrusive.
No, I don't need to worry about it. I'm the one that's intruding,
Oh, come on, you're not intruding.
No, you're always welcome in these Hangouts.
Well, I was actually... Yeah, I wish you'd come more often, actually. I was actually talking to Kevin in a private hangout. What was it, like 4 or 5 days ago, Kevin?
Something to that effect.
Yeah. And he has a really interesting idea about like Jesus as like a Jewish mystic kind of Essene kind of figure, which I thought was really fascinating, because I know similar ideas have been put forward
Sure.
by other scholars.
Well, mine's done so with a considerable degree of bias, largely because I practice a neo-pagan tradition. I practice Hellenic polytheism, so my actual worldview that I take to myself is done through that lens, through a more paganistic, indigenous kind of spiritual aspect. So
Sure.
I do that, and I recognize that that is a bias. So I do always consistently try to study, but it's just interesting to see how Jesus is viewed by different people. I mean, when I see Christians, there's very much this transubstantiation aspect that he is literally concurrent with God. And then when I see more atheistic and agnostic peoples who are addressing Jesus, it usually falls in one of two camps. Either Jesus didn't exist and is a complete lie, or he was just a regular dude who was completely misconstrued and misappropriated in the various Christian schools. But I actually feel that it's a little bit more intellectually honest to address him in the way that he would have been historically by many of the cultures in the area, especially the Greeks and the Egyptians, and many of the Jewish mystics. He was the leader of a mystery school. Really, I mean, that was what was going on in many different cultures in the area, and the influence of Alexandrian culture as this sort of mecca of esoteric and philosophical thought.
But one problem is you really can't take Jesus as being what people were seeing him as. In other words, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's what he was, but how he was viewed, that's very, very, very likely.
Yes, absolutely. But obviously the character of Jesus changed considerably in the convening centuries for various different reasons, both social, cultural, political, and because of the shifting authority of the church. But I do feel that some elements of what I'm saying is actually taking hold on some element, if for nothing else through fringe elements of Christian doctrine, whether it's more transcendental new thought versions of Jesus, an occultic version, a Gnostic version. More and more people are starting to look at these sorts of alternatives.
Yeah, I like what you said earlier too. That, well, for one thing, you recognized your bias, which is honest. A lot of people don't do that. But when you said that you like to hear all these different ideas of who Jesus was from different, I don't know, fields of scholarship or different sects within scholarship, for people to think about the question. And Albert Schweitzer, in his historical Jesus book, a part of his book, the beginning, was kind of devoted to going over the history of how different scholars kind of constructed their historical Jesus, and he kind of summed it all up saying that, you know, all the scholars before me constructed their historical Jesus basically as a mirror of themselves, essentially. Of course, he didn't think he was doing that, you know, but anyway, I just think it's funny that he was kind of summing it up in that way, like bringing out those biases, out, laying them all up on the table, you know, which
Yeah.
I think we all have those biases, and we need to be aware of them, and we don't want to be too influenced by them. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. And there's definitely a bias that I've seen on my avenue of pursuit through the neo-pagan community. I commonly see the figure of Jesus sort of relegated to disjointed and misappropriated pagan god, associated with any figure from any culture, anywhere from Horus to Dionysus to Apollo to Balder, and
Yeah.
oftentimes without a real historical, credible grounding in source material. And though that may have somewhat contributed to the sort of deification of Jesus from what seems to be an earlier, at least from my sort of perspective here, one of a mystery teacher, or a teacher of a mystery school, that is. I think it's far more valuable to take him to a more philosophical context, to a teacher, especially considering that so many of the other religions in the world usually view their teachers from that sort of perspective.
Mhm.
You're at most a prophet, and at least just a wise person. The idea of Jesus as a divine singular avatar of God, to just use a sort of placeholder term here, is incredibly unique, almost too unique, and obviously has not been questioned for centuries, save for a few small groups, the Arians, Arians with an I, and the various Gnostic groups in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance that were stamped out.
Yeah. Oh, I wanted to hit on something that you said when you first came in too about the I think it was you said demigods idea in relation to Jesus. I brought it up before, but I just wanted to reiterate it because Frank's in here. I know he might be interested, but yeah, I totally grab onto that idea too. And actually, a book that Dr. Price has recommended on his higher critical reading list is What is a Gospel? And what's weird is this book's by a guy named Charles H. Talbert, and he's arguing that the Gospels are basically fall in the genre of ancient biography, of Biol, or Biol, however you say it, in Greek. And then I read someone like Ehrman who's saying they're not biographies. And I'm like, okay, well, Talbert makes great arguments that they have so many similarities with ancient biography, which I was convinced by him. I think they do. But I'm wondering, like, why, if any of you guys know, why does Ehrman think that they're not in that genre?
I don't think they're biographies.
Not biographies in the modern sense. Biol, ancient biography.
Yeah, that's a
Very,
specific.
very different things.
Yeah, I think Mark is allegory, and then I think Luke is fictional history. But then with Matthew being somewhere in between the two, and John being its own thing. But I think the Gospel of Mark was an allegory from beginning to end, where Jesus was representative of the prophets and the temple and all the things that God had done for the Jews in the past. He's basically a placeholder, able to speak and act, representing those things.
Yeah, I can see that. I think Luke actually, though, is the gospel to me that seems to be presenting a Jesus that's like the embodiment of the prophet's relationship to Israel, the prophet, the rejected prophet. You know what I mean? Luke seems to really emphasize that more than any other gospel to me.
I think Ehrman is confusing. Like when he's talking about biography, he's talking about an historical account, and most critical scholars for quite a while have said, no, the Gospels are not meant to be history. They're theological works. They're meant to convince you that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. So I think he's not looking at subtle distinctions about when you say biography in that sense. He doesn't really understand that concept or is familiar with it.
Oh, so he's saying they're not biographies as in not a biography like Steve Jobs is a biography, but he would, do you think he would agree that they're Biol?
Yeah, if you cornered him or something, or paid money and got onto his blog or whatever, you could probably get with that. Yeah.
I don't think the Iliad and the Odyssey are biographies either, even though they have characters.
No, they're not. But you have ancient Biol, like, or biographies. I guess we should probably just use the Greek term since they are different than our modern biographies. Like, you have Biol of ancient Caesars, for example, where, I mean, there's heavy mythologizing going on. Like, they end their life and they end up getting taken up into heaven on a chariot or something like that, you know. So ancient biographies definitely. Am I still? Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. It looked like everything froze up. Yeah, the ancient biographies were not shy about um, the mythologizing aspect. You know. Anyway,
I see no evidence that, like the Gospel of Mark or even Matthew, is ever intending to recount actual events.
well, that's the whole point. Like,
Yeah, I think Luke pretends to be doing that, even though they're made up. But I don't think Matthew and Mark even pretend to. I think they're just, these should be. I think the readership at the time took them as fiction, as they were supposed to.
well, what I'm saying is that that fact is compatible with them being ancient biography.
Okay, you have to explain that to me better, but I think Vredar has also talked about the same subject. It might have even talked about the book that you're talking about, but it's been a month or years ago.
I would actually love to read that the Talbert book. I don't think anyone has a you know what copy of it though. But yeah, it's a really great book. I think he definitely establishes the case there. But I was just going off on that tangent based off what Kevin said, that there's just another example, I think, of they may not be technically 100% be all, but they share a lot of similarities with it. I think that's undeniable, and there's just one more avenue of Hellenistic influence in this, if you want to call Christianity Jewish sect or however you want to define it.
There is something else to looking at the earlier context, the pre-Christian context. I mean, the idea of a deified mortal, not just a demigod, somebody who's of a divine bloodline, wouldn't have been all that uncommon, especially in Rome. I mean, there were people who had lived, and I guess the allegory of their life became a deity. So they became a point of reference for a new cultus. The worship of like Antinous would have been an example of that. And there were several in ancient Egypt. Like Akhenaten was an example of that. He was a pharaoh who became, a sun god. And was
He's actually the founder of monotheism.
Yes, actually, exactly. So, I mean, there are examples of it happening, even to the extent of people relegating all of their worship to a single deified person. It's just not to the exact extent that was present in Christianity. But bearing in mind all the things that we've sort of brought up here, and I'm sure that you've brought up before I came here, really the climate of the region, cultural climate of the region and the time period really gave the right fertility for something like that to occur in the first place. For not only just the simple cult or mystery tradition of a specific deity, devotion is solely to that, or a monolithic kind of aspect of religion, but an actual its own individual thing with the figure of Jesus at the head of it, was going on for centuries.
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot that led up to that. And we always mention in some of these chats various different Jewish mystery schools that existed, various different Gnostic traditions that existed even before Jesus was said to have been born. So I just think that it's a little tempting to think of it as an inevitability. And I think it's more intellectually honest to look at it as a very likely course of events that occurred with all the things involved.
Yeah. I just wanted to say too about Akhenaten, like he did. I mean, he's our earliest evidence of a monotheist, but he obviously got the God wrong because R'hllor is the only true God. Just wanted to throw that out there.
Now you're talking.
Who is?
R'hllor.
Really, yeah.
Well, you know that there were other examples too. You
No, I
understand?
don't know that.
There were other examples you understand. The figure of Marduk and especially the Syrian counterpart Ashur, had a very strong sort of monotheistic theme. In that they largely represented the power of the state, the authority of the people there that were ruling. So much in fact that many of the symbols that were used for Assyria were simply that sun disk with Ashur in the center, very similar to how the Zoroastrians have a sun disk symbol with Zoroaster in the center, showing some pretty serious influence of those two cultures. So I mean, there were other cultures that had ideas of it. It's just they never all came together. It was like
Right.
when we look at a technology that's invented now, we look at the one technology and what it is and what it does, but oftentimes we don't look at the pieces that had to come together for that technology to exist. So I think it's valuable to use the analogy of technology when looking at belief systems, when looking at philosophical currents, because ultimately they're complementary in the way that they develop and further go into more modern kind of concepts.
Yeah. Yeah, the whole thing's so interesting. I've always wondered, like, what is it, and why is it that polytheism seems to have predated monotheism? Like, why is the general trajectory going from animism to polytheism to monotheism? Like, why didn't it start with monotheism, go to polytheism, and then to animism? You know what I mean? What's the reason for that trajectory?
Well, for one, and I don't mean to be aggressive with this, but it's a kind of a pet peeve of mine, and it's been like this for centuries in academia. The idea of the inevitability of monotheism is complete shit.
Oh, so it's not a real trend, is what you're saying?
No, that was something that was perpetuated by Western thinkers who were Christian and wanted to self-justify their belief system.
Now, do you think the other cultures that kind of, like, for example, Indian tradition seems to have coalesced on some kind of monotheism. Do you think that was because of Christian influence?
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
Pretty much all around the world, where there is a reformation of belief that moves towards some type of strict monotheism, it's usually through the influence of one of the Abrahamic traditions, even historically. So, why do I think monotheism developed out of polytheism? It's the influence of imperialism, the politicization of religious structures. The earliest traditions we have were household or tribal. They were by small groups of people, oftentimes through familial ties and things like that, and they emphasized more of a personal engagement. They were far less authoritarian. There was far less of a centralization of religious power, and that level of engagement was considered a threat to the development of the sorts of imperial governments that were developed post-Hellenistic, especially in Europe and the Middle East.
Yeah, that's interesting because I was saying earlier before you came here that to me a big part of Jewish monotheism seems to be directly related to monarchism in general. Like the religion itself seems to have a monarchical structure to it, which I don't think is an accident.
Well, go ahead.
I think the concept of like polytheism also is not it's also a later development because ultimately you have to decide or try to figure out, and there's various theories about the origin of religion itself. You know, what was its earliest forms? What did it take on? I think there's several viable theories that might be on the right track, but I would say that the concept of deity, as opposed to something like animistic spirits or ancestor worship or whatever, is a little bit more developed
Yes.
on the
It's,
timeline.
it's definitely the result of the technological advances that we see moving from the Iron Age into the Bronze Age. Consolidation of culture, the formation of writing, the formation of oral religious traditions, and disseminations of different mythologies and stories and plays, theater, and all those sorts of things, largely also brought about through higher populations, people living longer, having more food available to them, having more of a class breakdown, and people having the sorts of structures where temples can be erected in a specific area of a particular city, but also having people to work in those temples and work in the merchant district and be able to create weapons. And war is built into that. Politics is built into that. The sort of sophistication of culture. But the difference between the sort of evolution between animistic and polytheistic tradition, which is much more of a sort of natural sophistication of a system that's basically the same, going to exclusivist monotheism is a great jump in that aspect. And it's done so through a very forceful method. Monotheism, or even like what Bible Geek here is suggesting with like Shiva monotheism. That is done with the context that other schools within Hinduism are valid. Exclusivist, absolutist monotheism does so to the discredit of all other systems. It is completely unique from any other form of monotheism. Even the ones I could mention in Mesoamerica or in the Far East or in Turkic cultures or in northern cultures, Siberian cultures, which have elements of the sort of monotheistic concept. Also with China, which had a similar idea of that as well, with Tian.
Sorry, I'm reading the side chat here.
Yeah, that's quite a bit.
6th century. Really?
He makes a good point. Just to mention to those listening that there was a transition in the 6th century from monotheism, which is the sort of selective monotheism that you saw earlier, where people would attribute some level of ultimate divinity to a particular deity, or at least a favoritism of worshiping one deity over others, into exclusive monotheism is that transition.
So, Ruben, are you saying that you think Akhenaten was just a monolater and not a monotheist? But didn't he say that Aten was the only god there was, not just that he was the one he really liked the best?
Even if we can look at it from a modern perspective and look back at Atenism as a sort of monotheism, in the culture in which it developed, their context would have invariably been monotric, especially considering the nature of the kenotheistic context of Egyptian religion, where there was much more of a sort of migrating concept of the authority of divinity, depending on which kingdom and which time period Egyptian religion was being practiced.
I also brought up the point that because he was reviled later in history, that a lot of what we know may have come through people that want to deliberately misrepresent what he believed or did.
Yeah, largely through cultural reasons and very discriminatory sorts of what we would actually consider probably racist in modern times.
Well, I have to retract what I said then about Akhenaten.
But you're not wrong. It's just it gets a little bit more complicated than that.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, these categories have fuzzy boundaries, you know.
Fuzzy boundaries.
Yeah, it
Fuzzy
sounds like
math. You guys are doing fuzzy math.
your fuzzy boundaries sound a little dirty, Doug. Just saying.
He's going to the furry convention.
Yeah, no,
I love handcuffs and fuzzy boundaries.
I gotcha. That needs to be a book. That's probably a book. If it's not, it should be.
I need to get some
All
sleep.
right.
All right.
Don't go, John.
Oh man, I gotta get up at like 4:45, man.
Are you serious? What time is it over there?
It's 12:15.
Why do you have to get up so early?
I had to get the kids up.
Oh, do you get up that early every day?
They want us. Yeah, well, on Mondays I don't have to get up until 6. Actually, I start hitting the snooze alarm starting at 5:30, so I can actually get up at 6. So really, I'm hitting the snooze alarm at 4:45, so I can get up at 5:15. And this morning I was not successful because I was up late last night watching documentaries, and I must have hit the cancel button instead of snooze, because the next thing I know, it's 6:25. That gave my kids like 40 minutes to eat breakfast, get washed up, and get ready for school.
They have to get up that early for school?
Well, they're special needs kids, so they need a certain amount extra time. Plus, it has to be very regimented. Everything has to be.
Oh, wow. That's rough on you.
I'm used to it now, except on Tuesdays.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for coming, John.
Yeah,
Thanks, John.
I'm not really tired, and I wish I could hang out longer, but I know I'm going to be regretting it tomorrow.
Yeah, I hear you.
So thanks. It really got interesting eventually, right?
Yeah, Dan didn't stay long enough for the interesting parts.
Yeah, I thought it would kind of slow down after that, but I'm glad it picked up, though. Anyway, I'll see you guys. Take care. All right.
See you, John.
Thanks for stopping in. Bye.
Yeah.
Bye.